'70s and '80s, there was a lot of community theatre, like and a lot of people using theatre with different community groups, and there was also a lot of new theatre coming up. Out of that came another, like circus. People started using circus, so there was a group that kind of came out of that era in the '70s and '80s called the Women's Circus, WIM. I can't remember, but the Women's Circus. And Donna Jackson had read about this women's circus and went, why isn't there a women's circus for me? Then she did a play called No Myth, which was about women who had experienced domestic violence and abuse. And she used a bit of circus with those women. And what she saw in a train going past my house, sorry, what she saw in a very short space of time was using circus with women. It was an amazing way to get women back into their body, because most survivors of sexual assault or survivors of abuse, the way you survive abuse is to disconnect from your body. It's how I survive. It's how people survive. And so circus was a way, she observed, that women could incrementally, like gradually, come back into their body. Like it could be as slow as or as quick as, depending on the person. But it was a way you could actually see when someone leaves their body. You know, when you're driving your car and all of a sudden you're home and you go, oh, how did that happen? Well, it was the same. When you're teaching women how to climb on one another, you could see where they came to a moment of fear, and their natural response to fear was to leave their body. Because as survivors of abuse, that was what happened. That was their learnt response, was to be safe, you leave your body. So you could see that, and you could say, hey, come back, hello, look at me. So it was this amazing, she had this amazing experience, and then subsequently so did I. So she started the Women's Circus, and the first show was about women in prison. And I went along to that show. I think my son was 4. I was just coming out as a lesbian, like discovering who I was, and which was pretty terrifying and exciting all at once. And I went to see this show, and what I saw on stage was women who were very skilled and women who were beginners, but you really couldn't, like, they were just as amazing. The women who were on teeny tiny stilts were just as amazing and engaging as the women who were doing amazing things on trapeze. So what had been created was this place that was safe for everyone to go at their speed. And I just had this, because there's a book, the Women's Circus book, and the Women's Circus objectives in those first few years were, Women's Circus aims and objectives were to reaffirm women's control over their bodies, to build self-esteem through physical and performance work, to allow women to set their own personal goals for development, to create a safe, non-competitive environment for women to work in, to enable women of all different ages, abilities, shapes and sizes to come together to create a theatre event which was of a very high standard, to communicate feminist ideas in an entertaining and challenging fashion, to establish a women's circus theatre company which would be ongoing at the Footscray Community Arts Centre. So that was the very beginning and the very basis of what the Women's Circus was trying to do. So I saw that first show, fell in love, I'd always been quite a physical person, but I'd never done any kind of group like gymnastics, dance, none of that. So I came along to the circus, and quick as anything, I was tumbling, I was doing aerials. I was physically quite strong and quite flexible. And so within 6 months, I was teaching, because my background had been working with kids. I'd been a netball coach. I'd worked in childcare. I'd been a nanny. So I'd always worked with kids. So really quickly, I was teaching kids. And then very, very quickly, I was teaching the new women. And I started to create. There was already, it was already understood that the new women, Donna had understood that the new women needed their own space. And we also had childcare. We also, when we were doing a show, there was always food. Like there was a cooking crew, and there was a rigging crew, there was a music crew. So women coming in those early days of the women's circus, you might not want to be a performer, but it was this amazing environment of women. So there was a place for everyone, no matter whether you wanted to, because I love being on stage. I was fine with that. But there were many women who didn't. We had a bathing cap and a white face, which is a theatrical tool, but it was also a way for women to remain anonymous. But I have to say, the moment at the end of the show when we ripped those bathing caps off and stood in our own power was the most extraordinary moment of every show. So it was created, the idea was it was this community. And for me, it became my life and my career, which is obvious, but it also became a place where I was getting a political education. So, I had a young child. I'd come from a suburban family. I didn't have much of a feminist education or a political education. My sort of background was you get married, you have kids, and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by these women who'd been feminist, lesbian, separatists in the 70s, 70s and 80s, who'd been at the forefront of the fight for equality. And so all of a sudden I was learning these new amazing physical skills. I was learning about performance, and I was also learning about my place in the world and, my place as a woman. And so it was this extraordinary education across so many areas. And so that continued for a number of, I continued for a number of years. I began a new women's program. I started teaching I started teaching in the new women's program where I started to really develop the different skills that we would use, the different ways I was going to teach. I did some work with West Casa, which was the Centre Against Sexual Assault. So I started to work in partnership with other organisations, which helped the New Women's Program grow and develop, but it also helped my understanding of what circus meant in a community cultural development context. So I was teaching the New Women's Program. I had several children's circuses I worked with, and I also in 96 began with another colleague, Debbie Mazias, who was also from the Women's Circus. We began Westside Circus, which was initially for young women. And that circus is on the documentary. And so I began from the Women's Circus. There were so many of us that then went out into the community teaching circus. Some of us went out as technicians, riggers, lighting, sound, and there were all of these other people that came out of this model of a community cultural development project. And we were able to step into our power because we found something that we could learn in our own time. We found something that encouraged our natural abilities. Like, I was naturally very physical, very strong. You know, I loved being on the aerial gear. I was always on a cloud swing, always. And so, but other women really were into lighting, and some were into music. So women, from this initial idea, this amazing idea, this kind of network grew. And you can go to a lot of circus shows, professional circus shows in Melbourne, and there will be someone who started in the women's circus back in the 90s, or someone. And so we were taking that methodology of sharing skills out into the community. So it's just implicit in the way I teach. When I go into teaching, so my career then began to grow as a social circus teacher. I also continued to perform. And then I began working for Cirque du Soleil and Cirque du Monde. And I began to teach people how to teach. So it's a very different thing to teach an elite performer to teaching someone who is a survivor of sexual assault, or a child that is kind of that naughty kid that doesn't fit in anywhere. It's a very different kind of style of teaching. And so I guess I learned really quickly that it was quite different to teach someone who was there and wanted to learn, to someone who was there because they were in trouble. Or I worked a lot with young mums, like really young mums who didn't know how to play with their children. And so circus was a great way for them to learn about, remind themselves that play actually is an important aspect of parenting. So I was taking that out into the community. And when I started to work for Cirque du Monde, I started to work in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And again, I was using this methodology of using social circus to, for instance, in Singapore, I was going into jails, into juvenile jails. And my hidden agenda there was to teach those young men that women were strong. And so what I would do is, my colleague was a very big man, and I used to balance him on my feet, and the boys would all go, oh! And so circus has all those aspects where we can teach we can teach community cultural development in whatever that community is. In Hong Kong, I was working with a high-level school because the young women there got to puberty and would no longer make eye contact, which was a cultural norm. It was normal. But the school wanted the young women, because these young women were going to be leaders in their, jobs, and often in Western society, to learn how to make eye contact. So I was brought in to teach circus. So it was, what I discovered really quickly was it was a way to teach all sorts of, to go into a community perhaps that is struggling with their kids being in trouble all the time, teach them about what it is to work together. Because in every community, every country, every culture I've been to, people understand or have the image in their head of pulling up the tent. Do you know what I mean? When we all work together to pull up the tent, every country has that in their head somewhere, that it's an image that they know. And so circus is that starting point of working together. Wherever you're from, it's something that works really well. In Africa, we would go into the communities, like more remote communities, and we would do circus with, 30, 40 small kids, and the families would come out and they'd see the children behaving in a positive way, which then had an impact on how that community saw the children. In Aboriginal communities, I would go in and I would work with the children first, and then the children would teach the teachers circus. Now, in Aboriginal communities, in remote communities, there's a lot, they're struggling with a lot. There's, the dispossession of Aboriginal people in Australia has led for generational poverty. The problems are massive. And so the teachers would often not have a lot of success in trying to teach, regular school. So we would go in and teach circus, and the kids would be amazing at circus. And then the kids would teach the teachers, and then the teachers would have a positive response to the children. So from this small community arts project in Footscray, which is a western suburb of Melbourne. I don't know how that works in Mexico. So it's a suburb that was traditionally had a lot of refugees. It was a very poor suburb, very working class suburb. It didn't have a lot of arts in it. From this western suburbs inner city place has grown this, like the women's circus is still there. I think it's very different because circus has become a massive thing in Australia. There's so many professional circus companies, so it's not the community. I don't know, I'm not there. But it's still going, over 20 years later. 20 years later, it's still going. So that's in itself is so exciting. As I said, I went off and I was working for Cirque du Soleil, and I also went to work for NICA, which is the National Institute of Circus Arts in Melbourne. NICA had a commitment to work with Indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities in remote areas. So I continue to do social circus work, but I worked for the women's circus and NICA for a little while, but then I had to, I was traveling so much. And so we started going to remote communities all over Australia to offer circus. And I had one police officer in one of the remote communities said, the 2 weeks you were here, we had no crime, because the kids are doing something that's exciting. They're doing something where they succeed. It's fun. There's lots, like you can do mini tramp, unicycle, Diablo, build pyramids, do tumbling, do tight white. There's so much that you can, pack into a truck to take to a community. So, the last 15 years, I've been I've been working for Cirque du Monde as well as NICA, and going to many, many different remote places within Australia and overseas, and using this model of community cultural development through circus. And so I've worked with Aboriginal communities. I've worked with non-English speaking background communities. So helping people learn English through circus. So we would say, okay, we're going to build a cat tower. And we'd have words spread out everywhere, and they would have to go and pick the 2 words that said cat tower. So I've used circus in those communities. I've used circus in the queer community quite a bit, because that's a community I've been involved in quite a lot in Australia. You name it, young mums. I've worked with the elderly. The oldest person I've worked with was 90, and she waved a flag like that. It was so cool. And now because circus is such a massive thing in Australia, people are quite interested to have a go. You know, we use it in all sorts of communities now, and that all grew for me from this discovery of this. You know, I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and it was something that I went to this place thinking, hey, cool, I'm going to do some trapeze, to it becoming a lifelong passion of, I do a number of different things now. Because of COVID, there hasn't been much in the way of circus. So I'm a chaperone. So I work on a theatre show, work on Harry Potter. I'm teaching swimming now. I do all sorts of things. And this way of operating in the world and the way of working with, particularly with young people, is now embedded in everything I do. And it came from learning about being my best self, my authentic self, learning about how I learn, and through that understanding everyone learns in a different way. All of those skills that I learned in those first few years at the Women's Circus have absolutely been embedded in whatever I do now. Moment of taking the bathing cap off. It's a moment of standing in power, in pride, in my own strength. And I mean, pride is a weird word, but it would have to be pride. I would stand there so proud of myself, because no one got me to where I was except me. Like my hard work, my training, my turning up. We used to say at the Women's Circus that you had to turn up to training, even if you had a better offer. You needed to turn up, because you can't build the pyramid if everyone doesn't turn up. So we actually had a job description that we would sign, and in that was, you had to turn up if you had a better offer, if you're feeling like crap, if you had your period, if you blah blah blah, all these things. And so in that moment, I stood very strong in my own power, and it was a power of, a lot of my life I'd been out of control, and I was always in trouble. And so it's just, look at me, hey, I'm excellent. So it was quite amazing, quite an amazing moment. So I have to say, in Australia, we're also in a time and place where we're talking a lot about consent. Our recent Australian of the Year was a young woman who had been sexually assaulted by a teacher. So we are still working very hard. In the 90s, there was a bubble of women who were working together to make change, and then that sort of dissipated. Now we're also having marches. We are also talking about. We're trying to raise the issue of consent. So a big thing at the moment is, how do we teach consent? How do we teach young boys about consent? This is a very big problem. We're experiencing. It's a big problem. It's always been a big problem. But it's now young women are now stepping up to talk about, I went to a party, I got drunk, and I was raped. And the conversation is, everyone is trying to change the conversation to, instead of, well, you shouldn't have got drunk, to, the boy shouldn't have done that. So that's the work that's happening in Australia at the moment. we're trying to work together. We're all trying to work together to make change. We're trying to, as women, we are trying not to victim blame. We are trying not to say, okay, so you shouldn't have been out at 2 a.m. because if you weren't out at 2 a.m., that wouldn't have happened. We're trying to change that conversation and support one another in that conversation, and to teach our young men and our young boys about what consent is. So that's the discussion that's happening at the moment in Australia, is what is consent? How do we teach consent? How do we teach young women? How do we teach young men not to rape young women? Not how do we teach young women to be safe? We're trying to shift the conversation. You know, forever the conversation was, how do we keep young women safe? Well, that's not what we should be talking about. So that's all over the media in Australia. That is the conversation. On the more left of politics, the people talking about how do we change society, that's what's being discussed. And it's starting to come into a little bit commercial TV, which is, you know, out in the suburbs, people watch. They're having the conversations about, well, how do we teach our sons not to rape? Not how do you teach your daughter to carry keys in her hand, to not have her earphones in. We don't want that conversation anymore. But I didn't know anything about women disappearing in Mexico. So that's very new to me. And again, that is just so, because again, you must be talking to women about always walk in a group, always blah, 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 always. And that's how the discussion has shifted in Australia. People are saying, no, it's not about what women do. It's about what men do. And how do we teach them not to do that? So, you know, and there's a lot of people talking about how do we teach respect. So those are the conversations that are starting to happen in schools. Instead of just sex education, how do we teach consent? And what age do we begin to teach consent? There are commercials on the TV now in Australia. There'll be a little boy and he's pulling a girl's hair, and you have one scenario where the mother says, oh, that's just boys, and another mother who says that's not okay. This is where we need to teach. So that's on TV in Australia, that ad. We're still working very hard. You know, my son is in his 30s, and 2 years ago, a woman got raped and murdered in a park very close to where I live. And he said to me, but you don't walk there late at night, do you? You don't walk the dog. And I said, that should not be our conversation, Oliver. That should not be what we're talking about. She was a poor comedian and couldn't afford a taxi or an Uber home. So she caught a tram and walked. And she was about, I don't know, 500 meters from her home. And this guy had followed her. You know, so, you know, I said, even my son, I said, that's not the conversation. She should be safe. So we just have to keep working together. All of us around the world. I think the arts are a way to offer people a voice. So social circus, because of the physicality of social circus, it will always be an amazing way for people to come back into their bodies, particularly as we spend a lot of time online. You know, a lot of our world is online now. And I know with COVID that's been really quite a wonderful thing, that we've still been able to access so much. But people will crave that physical contact. And so social circus or circus will still be a way you know, where we can go out and have physical contact and use our bodies and be physical. The challenge, what I've seen in Australia, is the challenge of not everyone wants to be a circus performer. And so that will often a thing, you see it in dance and in when you play an instrument. Not everyone wants to be a performing artist. So, and social circus means different things in different communities. In Australia, it's not necessarily about getting a job. But I know in Chile, it was a way to provide, find someone a job. So social circus needs to be able to move and adapt to whatever community you're in. The outcome isn't necessarily an elite performer or a show even. Sometimes with social circus, doing a show is not a good idea because it's too much pressure. So to social circus is always going to be wonderful because I just believe it has the capacity to offer so many things and change people's lives. It's going to be for us as practitioners of social circus to remember it means different things to different communities, different groups. For some young people in Australia, it's about getting them back into education. In perhaps Mexico, maybe it's a way to create a safe space for women. Maybe in Africa, it is an opportunity for people to have work. It means different things. And we as practitioners, it's about us continuing to remember each community you go to has different needs and ideas of what this is going to be for them. And so if we can continue to adapt and change in a world that's more and more online, people are going to need to get into the park and physically do all sorts of things. And also, as you know, like as we age, we need to find fun ways to move our bodies. We need to find fun ways when you've got kids that you put your phone down and play with your child. It's so much fun throwing a child around, like your own child. And so social circus can provide those things. And it's about, for all of us who teach, it's about us understanding what's going to work for that community. And so we continue to learn and grow. But yeah. Favorite anecdote in the film, there's a point, there'd been this kid I'd been working with for ages and ages and ages, and he was on a really they were on a really low trapeze. And the moment that child told me to move away, like they put one hand on the trapeze and the other hand on the trapeze, and I was still holding them, and they said, "Let go." And I said, "What?" And the child said, "Let go." And it meant I could let them go. Now, that had taken months to get to that point of letting that child go. I just think social circus can change the world. And, you know, I see it every day. I see it, you know, when the police officer said to me in a remote Australian town, you know, we haven't had any criminal activity since you've been here. You know, that's it. That's it. That's, you know, you offer, yeah. It's just the most wonderful thing, I think. And the smiles of kids' faces when they leave the room is pretty damn cool. And the parents. That's a very hard question because, as I said, each community or each culture or each group I work with has a different desired outcome. For me, I guess it's not about creating performers, but if I went to a place where that was vital to someone's survival, well, then yes, it would be social circus. I think there's so much in the world where social circus could help. You know, maybe if you did a social circus program in Indonesia, you could use plastic bags that could lead to a discussion on rubbish, because they have a big problem in Indonesia with rubbish and plastics. Always respect and always creating trust. Maybe not making someone do something that they don't want to do. Mm-hmm. But again, when I go and work with young people, I say my job is to challenge you, and I will try and challenge you. But my job also is to hear and respect your no, because that's what we're trying to teach young women as well, is to say no and for their no to be heard. But my job as a circus coach is to challenge. So it's very hard sometimes to balance those. But I talk about that. I actually articulate what my job as the coach is, but my job is also to create a sense of trust and respect. So I have to hear no as well. So with a young person, that might be a discussion of, okay, can you try it once? And if you're still fearful or you still don't like it, we won't do it again. But again, ultimately, I have to hear no. But it can be quite a conflict of my job is to challenge, but my job is also to hear no. It's really hard sometimes, particularly with young women who have already got their self-esteem is so low that they just believe they can't do anything. I work a lot with young women like that. I think it's really exciting that we continue. We need to talk about it, and we need to get people to understand. You know, people really don't understand what social circus is. They don't understand the difference. And I think it's great that we continue to talk about it and to talk about all of the things that it can be, and all of, you know, the way, say, a small program like the Women's Circus, how big an impact that's had on so many lives. You know, I turned 60 in January and I'm still circusing. So, you know, it's had an impact on my life since I was in my 30s. So, and I'm still out there believing I can change the world. And that's come from this very small community circus program in a western suburb of Melbourne. You know, if you take love and trust and respect out every day with you, it makes a change.